In the vast chamber of the Galactic Council, power had always spoken with the certainty of eternity. The delegates who filled the tiers of carved stone and hovering platforms had long believed their empires untouchable, their traditions unbroken, their fleets absolute arbiters of fate. When the human envoy was granted the floor, it was out of curiosity rather than respect. Few even concealed their amusement at the sight of a species so new to the stars, their voices and expressions framed by the arrogance of civilizations that had ruled for millennia. The words that followed, however, struck with a weight that lingered even as the laughter began to ripple across the chamber. The envoy declared that humanity did not seek conquest, did not covet thrones or planets, but that should harm befall them, should arrogance bring war to their people, there would be no forgiveness, no ceasefire, no end until the enemy was hunted into silence. The statement was not delivered with bravado but with a quiet certainty, like a law of nature spoken aloud. Yet the chamber erupted in derision. Delegates leaned to one another, muttering jokes about primitive instincts, about savages who still believed in myths of vengeance. Some laughed so openly their attendants struggled to maintain decorum. The most ancient among them spoke of humanity as a curiosity, a small flame that could be extinguished by a single breath. Their view of the galaxy was built on the belief that power resided in overwhelming fleets, and the intimidation of those too weak to resist. Warnings of endless pursuit, of hunters who never relented, seemed like superstition to species that trusted in walls of starships and weapons that could burn continents. They spoke of Earth as little more than fertile territory waiting for proper administration, dismissing its people as an accident of biology that had learned to crawl among the stars too soon. The arrogance of the chamber was not unanimous. A few voices urged caution, pointing to the ferocity displayed in early skirmishes where humans had already resisted minor incursions with a tenacity uncharacteristic of species so young. But these whispers were drowned out by the thunder of certainty. Mockery carried more weight than analysis. The notion that prey might someday become predator was unthinkable to those who had always assumed their place at the top of the hierarchy. Their confidence was further bolstered by centuries of precedent. No species had ever challenged the council and survived. Those who had attempted resistance were either annihilated or assimilated into the machinery of imperial rule. Humanity, in their eyes, would follow the same path. What none of them understood was the difference between humanity and the others who had bent the knee. Those past civilizations had measured survival by compromise, by preserving fragments of identity under the shadow of dominance. Humans, however, had shaped their history around endurance through fire. They had outlasted plagues, wars, and disasters that should have ended them. They carried scars not as weaknesses but as reminders. The envoy's words had not been performance. They were the distilled essence of a history where surrender had always meant extinction. But to the council, those words were comedy. The session ended with a decree that Earth would be brought into compliance. A campaign of intimidation was authorized, fleets already moving to enforce obedience. The idea that humanity could resist was dismissed without serious debate. For the council, the warning was forgotten almost as soon as the envoy was escorted out, reduced to a curious anecdote of the day. In the records of the assembly, the moment was summarized with the cold brevity of bureaucrats. Human delegate issued threats inconsistent with capacity. That was all. Yet beneath the polished language, the contempt, and the certainty of victory, something had shifted unnoticed. In dismissing the warning, the council had already sealed its fate. By laughing at the promise of eternal pursuit, they ensured that when the time came, the laughter would be remembered not as proof of strength but as the last act of a species too blind to recognize the predator at its door. For humanity, the memory of that chamber, of the sneers and scorn, would burn like fuel in the long years to come. For the council, it would be a moment replayed endlessly in whispers of regret, the instant they mistook silence for weakness and warnings for empty words. The first sanctioned actions against humanity were not framed as war but as demonstration. The council believed a show of force would be enough to bend Earth into submission, as it had countless others. Fleets were dispatched with overwhelming confidence, their commanders speaking of the assignment as routine, a matter of procedure rather than danger. They expected fear, capitulation, the rapid collapse of a young species unprepared for galactic order. The early strikes targeted outlying colonies and transport vessels, cutting trade lines and destroying habitats built with fragile optimism. To the Council, these were warnings. To humanity, they were declarations of intent. The losses were real and devastating, yet the effect was not despair. Across human colonies, a resolve unlike anything the Council had anticipated took root. Instead of pleading for mercy, communities tightened their defenses and swore vengeance. Survivors of destroyed convoys recorded messages not of surrender but of defiance, promising to return blow for blow. Military officers spoke of adaptation rather than defeat, preparing to study the tactics and weaknesses of their attackers. The Council's intelligence services, monitoring broadcasts, were puzzled by the absence of panic. Where other species had wailed or begged, humans spoke with calm determination, as if the campaign had awakened something that had always lain beneath their civility. Initial human counterattacks were dismissed as trivial, carried out by fleets far smaller and less advanced. But their precision unsettled the Council's strategists. Ships targeted supply depots rather than defenses, striking where fuel and provisions were stored. Patrols vanished in regions thought secure. Captured alien officers reported ambushes that came with unnerving silence, missiles and boarding actions executed with a clarity of purpose that suggested careful study. The Council excused these incidents as anomalies, isolated events not worthy of strategic reconsideration. They clung to the belief that scale would crush defiance, that numerical superiority made persistence irrelevant. Yet reports grew harder to ignore. Merchant convoys began refusing routes near human space, terrified of raids that left no survivors. Commanders complained of soldiers shaken by rumors, describing enemies who never stopped pursuing retreating ships until fuel was exhausted. Smaller colonies on the edge of human reach whispered of shadow fleets appearing without warning, taking vengeance for earlier atrocities. Still, in the halls of authority, these warnings were brushed aside. Leaders mocked the anxiety of their subordinates, interpreting fear as incompetence rather than recognition of danger. Among humans, the mindset hardened further. Strategic councils on Earth drew upon centuries of history, recognizing patterns in the enemy's arrogance. They did not attempt to match fleet for fleet or world for world. Instead, they prepared for something the Council could not fathom, a conflict not measured by territory but by endurance and pursuit. Every raid, every skirmish became data, studied and dissected until patterns of weakness emerged. Humanity absorbed each loss as fuel, shaping responses that turned pain into weaponry. The first major retaliation caught the Council off guard. A supply line critical to their campaign was severed not by chance but by deliberate orchestration. Every ship in the convoy was destroyed, their escorts eliminated with tactics that mirrored the Council's own but twisted to exploit blind spots. Investigations revealed human forces had learned to anticipate responses, striking with unnerving foresight. It was the beginning of a pattern. Each Council action was met with retaliation sharper than before, each attempt at intimidation answered with strategies refined by relentless analysis. In the Council chambers, confidence remained outwardly unshaken, yet cracks began to form beneath the surface. Private conversations hinted at unease. A handful of strategists began to warn that humans were not responding as predicted, that their resistance was not the desperation of prey but the preparation of predators. These voices were drowned out by the louder chorus of ridicule, insisting humanity's defiance was temporary. Laughter still filled the chamber when reports were delivered, but it carried a brittle edge, a need to convince themselves of superiority. For humanity, the stage of endurance had already passed. The strikes against their colonies had transformed grief into collective fury. They no longer saw themselves as victims of aggression but as hunters preparing to stalk those who had dared to threaten them. The early battles became stories shared across every settlement, reminders that survival would not be enough. The enemy would have to pay, not in victories claimed on charts but in blood and fear carried into the depths of their empires. The Council thought they had begun a war of dominance. In truth, they had ignited the first sparks of a hunt that would never cease. What began as scattered retaliation soon hardened into something the Council had never encountered, a campaign without boundaries, waged not for conquest but annihilation of threat. Human fleets, once thought primitive, shifted into patterns alien tacticians struggled to predict. They no longer met the enemy in open battle unless advantage was certain. Instead, they struck like predators closing in on wounded prey. Patrols vanished without distress signals. Stations believed secure reported sudden boarding actions, their defenses bypassed with uncanny precision. Survivors described attackers who seemed to know exactly where to strike, as if their minds had been dissected and their habits catalogued. The transformation unsettled even seasoned commanders. Alien captains who once boasted of easy victory now demanded reinforcements for routine assignments, unnerved by stories of relentless pursuit. Ships that retreated were hounded across sectors, engines burned out from constant acceleration as humans refused to let them escape. Carcasses of destroyed warships were discovered stripped of weapons and technology, evidence that humans were not merely fighting but learning at an alarming pace. What should have been proof of Council superiority became fuel for further terror, as human forces adapted captured systems into their own arsenals within weeks. The psychological tide turned swiftly. Soldiers who had laughed at the endless threat began whispering in barracks of invisible hunters, enemies who marked them individually and would never stop chasing. Some spoke of entire units erased in silence, with no transmissions beyond a final scream. Others recounted how human infiltrators reached command officers even in supposedly fortified environments, leaving messages carved into walls or broadcast across frequencies declaring that the hunt would not end. Morale that had seemed unshakable eroded faster than fleets could be rebuilt. Within the Council, debates grew more frantic. At first they attributed human success to luck, then to isolated brilliance. Yet when reports continued to arrive describing entire campaigns undone by small strike groups, the excuses faltered. Analysts charted casualty rates and found a disturbing trend. Every month of conflict increased human efficiency while Council losses accelerated. Where once dozens of ships could suppress a colony, now entire flotillas were required, and still some never returned. Leaders who had once jeered at the notion of humans as hunters began lowering their voices, speaking of something worse than rebellion, a species that turned war into pursuit and pursuit into obsession. The most terrifying element was persistence. Battles ended, campaigns closed, but the humans did not stop. Even when Council fleets withdrew, human forces followed. Even when sectors were abandoned, their shadow remained, picking apart stragglers, eliminating survivors, never allowing wounds to heal. The lesson spread quickly across the rank and file. No defeat ended the conflict, no retreat guaranteed safety. To fight humans meant living under a perpetual sentence of being stalked. Technological superiority ceased to comfort. Weapons that had awed lesser civilizations became familiar to human tacticians, their counters refined through captured data and hard experience. Shields once thought impenetrable failed under combinations of munitions assembled in ways no Council engineer had considered. Even strategies centuries old, tested in countless wars, were anticipated and unraveled by minds that treated every battle as a puzzle to be solved. The longer the war dragged on, the clearer it became that humanity's true weapon was not firepower, but a refusal to yield until the enemy was undone. Council assemblies grew quieter with each session. The laughter that had greeted the envoy's words was absent now, replaced by an unease no decree could silence. Delegates avoided speaking the truth aloud, but in their hearts they knew the balance had shifted. They had believed themselves unassailable, yet their fleets bled, their trade faltered, and their soldiers feared shadows more than battles. Humanity had become what they had mocked, a relentless hunter whose promise of eternal pursuit was no exaggeration but a reality written into the void. And still, the humans showed no sign of slowing. The escalation reached a stage where even the most entrenched Council members could no longer pretend control remained theirs. Human offensives spread across multiple regions with a precision that suggested long planning, though in truth it was adaptation honed by countless lessons from prior engagements. Entire sectors that once served as launch points for alien dominance became killing grounds where fleets were shredded in days. What unsettled the Council most was not only the scale of retaliation, but its deliberate nature. Humans chose targets not at random but with a clarity that crippled infrastructure, paralyzed supply chains, and dismantled the very foundations of power. Worlds that had existed under Council protection for centuries awoke to find their orbital defenses sabotaged, their communication relays silenced, their fleets absent. Human task forces moved with speed that made distance irrelevant. Systems previously believed untouchable were struck simultaneously, as if no corner of the galaxy lay beyond their reach. The purpose was unmistakable, not conquest, not occupation, but demonstration that no fortress, no throne, no authority could hide from human retribution. Accounts from alien commanders revealed a pattern that disturbed even hardened veterans. When human fleets attacked, they did not simply destroy, they dismantled. Enemy vessels were not merely defeated but rendered into wreckage with surgical strikes that spared no possibility of recovery. Ground installations were neutralized with chilling efficiency, leaving infrastructure useless without prolonged rebuilding. What survivors carried back was not only the story of defeat but of terror, of enemies who struck with the patience of hunters, ensuring the prey had no chance to recover. The Council, once unified by arrogance, fractured under the strain. Member species that had joined in laughter at the warning now accused one another of weakness, of dragging the entire assembly into a conflict none could control. Some demanded immediate withdrawal, others clamored for extermination on a scale that would wipe Earth itself from existence. But even as they argued, they knew such plans required coordination and stability they no longer possessed. Each new report of defeat eroded the illusion of authority. Each whisper from fleeing soldiers added weight to the fear that nothing would stop the relentless pursuit. Rumors began to travel faster than truth. Stories circulated of humans following individual commanders across light years, tracking them beyond battlefields into exile, eliminating them years after campaigns had ended. Tales of entire fleets disappearing into silent regions were repeated as warnings, fueling paranoia among officers who no longer trusted their orders. Even those who dismissed such stories admitted the possibility that humans would never cease hunting those who had drawn their ire. Fear became a weapon greater than missiles or guns, reshaping the will of entire populations. Desperation bred reckless measures. Certain Council factions attempted to deploy catastrophic weapons, hoping overwhelming devastation would force humanity to halt. But each attempt failed, either intercepted before deployment or turned back with consequences more terrible than the original intent. Instead of fear, such actions deepened humanity's resolve, reinforcing the principle that nothing short of absolute security could end their campaign. Every escalation tightened the noose, every desperate strike added to the reasons humanity would never forgive. The most sobering realization was that humans were not expanding to build an empire. They left worlds in ruins but did not settle them, dismantled fleets but did not claim them. Their war was not about territory but about ensuring no hand that had raised itself against them would ever rise again. This philosophy confounded the Council, who had always assumed wars ended with treaties or occupation. To face a species that demanded nothing but the eradication of threats was to face an enemy without a bargaining table, without a threshold of loss at which they would concede. By the time the Council accepted the truth, its authority was gone. Entire species began withdrawing allegiance, unwilling to suffer the hunt on behalf of allies. Some secretly sought terms, others attempted neutrality, but all discovered the same lesson: once marked, there was no path to safety. Humanity had shifted from defending its survival to reshaping the galaxy's balance of fear. The warning once mocked had become prophecy, and the echo of laughter in the Council chamber now returned as a memory sharpened into dread. The galaxy's memory was reshaped in silence, carved not by treaties or monuments but by absence. Where once the Council had ruled with proclamations and fleets, there now stood ruins and echoes of laughter turned bitter. Humanity did not parade victories or demand tribute. They left no banners upon the worlds they struck. Instead, they moved on, relentless, carrying the hunt further and further until no surviving commander could rest without glancing over their shoulder. The pursuit became less a war and more a certainty that once provoked, humanity would never release its prey. The survivors among the Council's species spoke of a fear deeper than conquest. Conquerors at least could be bargained with, appeased with wealth or territory. Humans accepted nothing, demanded no gifts, and offered no compromises. To them, justice meant permanence. Once wronged, they pursued until the line of vengeance was complete, until those who had lifted a hand against them ceased to exist as a threat. Entire generations of aliens came to maturity with the stories, not as myths but as lived history. Mothers whispered warnings to their children, never harm a human, never mock their words, for they will remember until the end of time. Even in regions untouched by battle, the effect was profound. Neutral species adjusted policies, fearing the possibility of inadvertently drawing humanity's wrath. Trade agreements were rewritten to exclude council remnants, colonies abandoned alliances that risked entanglement. The influence of the once mighty council dissolved faster than any collapse in history, not because of political maneuvers but because every power understood that humans did not forgive. To be associated with those who had laughed at the envoy's warning was to risk becoming prey in turn. For humanity, the transformation was quiet but absolute. They had not set out to conquer empires or rule the galaxy, yet their reputation alone established a power greater than empires could claim. They became the measure by which all aggression was weighed. Any species considering hostility now calculated not only immediate gains but the possibility of centuries-long pursuit by hunters who never tired. Fear became the shield humanity had never intended but willingly carried. Where diplomacy failed, the memory of relentless vengeance spoke louder than any anvil. The few remaining council officials, stripped of their fleets and authority, lived as exiles haunted by the memory of that chamber where arrogance had been their undoing. They remembered the envoy's calm declaration, the promise that had been dismissed as the bravado of primitives. Now they saw it etched across star systems. Humans did not threaten idly. They warned, and if ignored, they acted until the warning became truth. Those officials spent their final days not in rebuilding but in regret, telling younger generations that the greatest mistake was to laugh when silence should have been heeded. In the centuries that followed, the legend only deepened. Stories spread of humans appearing generations later to settle forgotten debts, of commanders who thought themselves safe only to be tracked across lifetimes. Whether true or myth, the perception held power. Entire fleets stood down without a fight, entire sectors surrendered without resistance, not because humans demanded it but because the memory of the hunt had already decided the outcome. Humanity had become less a rival civilization and more a force of nature, the embodiment of persistence beyond reason. The final lesson was not written in proclamations but in fear etched into the very fabric of interstellar society. Every council, every assembly, every leader weighed their decisions against the single truth: humanity would never be prey, never be forgotten, never cease once provoked. The envoy's words, once a source of ridicule, had become law across the stars. Humans will hunt you forever, until it is too late. The laughter that had greeted the warning had long since died, replaced by silence broken only by whispers of respect and fear. The galaxy understood at last that the promise had not been exaggeration, but prophecy fulfilled in the most absolute form.